Let's begin.
Okay, just 1 second. Yeah, good morning, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov to all of you. Just to finish off from last week, by the way, if there are any questions that were left out last week, you're welcome to come and ask. Maybe on chat. If you have a question, you can put it on chat and I'll have a look later on. Now I owe you the the reply to the proposed plan of it's an engineer, Eidler from Zurich, which has made a very extensive investigation of the Jewish calendar. There are various suggestions out there. The situation is that for the time being, our calendar has moved some 5-6 days ahead. If we compare with the with the spring month, considering the spring month to be from the 21st of March to the 20th of April, you have probably noticed that also this year we are going to have Pesach after the 20th of April, and it can be even a few days later. So, and the error which is built into the Jewish calendar and the calculation of time has an error of 1 day per 216 years. Now, there is a suggestion that we should wait and see until the error gets up to a full month, and then we could take a leap year and cut that month out. But as you can easily see, that is going to take thousands of years before we get to that point. So instead, he has a plan which does not make any immediate change in the calculation of time, but it involves that from time to time, instead of having a 19-year cycle of leap years, as we talked about last week, we should from time to time have an 11-year cycle, which will rectify the built-in error. But he doesn't suggest to do anything, not tomorrow, not next year. Actually, his plan, because it is going to take a very long time to convince all the various religious authorities to agree to such a change. His actual suggestion is starting sometime in about 400 years' time. So everybody can relax and sit back and wait and start thinking about it. But none of us here today will probably live at the time when this plan possibly gets into action. So,
Pinchas, I mentioned to you we were strolling actually in the presidential gardens of the in Jerusalem and discussing this, and I said I think it's quite optimistic to think that within 400 years you can get all the rabbis to agree on any one thing.
Could be, but at a certain time, the rabbis did agree to the calculated calendar, which was a big revolution in the calculation of time for the Jewish people. So with 400 years to go, maybe I like the story about the 3 soldiers who were outstanding during the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon wanted to reward them. And now he asked each of them in turn what they would like as a reward for their heroism. So there was a Czech soldier. He wanted a free Czechoslovakia, free Czechia. And then there was the Pole. He said his family had a brewery which had been destroyed during the war, so he would like a new brewery. And then to each of them, Napoleon said, "You will have what you wish." And then came the Jew who had distinguished himself and said, "I would like a herring, a good herring." So Napoleon said, "You shall have it." And the others came to him and said, "You crazy man, you have your life's chance to ask the emperor for some reward and you ask for a herring." So I said, "You won't get Czechia, you won't get the brewery. Maybe I'll get the herring." So maybe in 400 years' time, the rabbis will be convinced. Okay, if you will allow me, I will use your share screen.
I think you should be able to share.
Yeah. It should be okay. It should be okay. Where am I? There's the screen I wanted. Just a second.
I'll just mention something which I think is important as you find your screen, is that one of the we can ask our question, wait, if the calendar is wrong, are we actually celebrating Pesach during the wrong time? And what is beautiful is that the Torah teaches us that we shall follow the rulings of our sages. In other words, whatever that the sages are empowered to teach us the halacha of what is the right thing to do. And therefore, as long as the sages tell us that this is the calendar that we have now, then we're doing the right thing. So we have people like Pinchas and this engineer who can be doing the great calculations, but we can be simple Jews and just follow the calendar that we're given by our local rabbi and know that we're doing the right thing. So it's a very powerful thing that the reality is set based upon the wisdom, according to the Torah, based on the wisdom of the sages. I just wanted to mention that, and you can continue now.
Thank you. Now, before we start, I want to tell you that the talk I'm going to give today is based upon a thesis for the MA degree at Bar-Ilan University, which I completed some 3 years ago. The actual question raised in the thesis was about the Copenhagen Jewish community calendar, and particularly investigating the first printed calendar that was issued in the Jewish community in Copenhagen, which was in 1861. And then checking over the years what changes have been made. And the question posed was what the halachic considerations were for the times fixed in that calendar. I think it is relevant also from those of you who are not from Copenhagen, but from the other Scandinavian communities, because the problems concerning the halachic times of Judaism, the problems are more or less identical. They are maybe somewhat less problematic in Copenhagen than in some of your cities, but we'll see that more in detail later on in the presentation. So that's why I have this title for the talk, Vaivoka in Copenhagen, the night, and it should be day in Copenhagen. And we'll see what subjects we are going to cover. We are going to learn something about the various halachic times in general, and then we will concentrate on the particular problems in the northern hemisphere and the northern part of the northern hemisphere. So the subjects we'll deal with is what it is the halachic times. What do I mean when I say halachic times? We'll then, in particular, speak about the period of twilight, which is a very central part of the halachic problem with the halachic times. We'll see how long it does take to walk what is called a mile in the Talmud. We'll learn what a temporal hour is about. And we'll see how our sages in the Talmud, how they calculated and how they described the length of twilight, particularly in the evening. And then we'll learn about the Rabbi Raphael Halevi from Hanover, who was a great innovator in this field. And then we'll go over and see, particularly in the northern countries, the problems of the twilight. And then we look at the Jewish calendar in Copenhagen and what changes there have been over the years. Now, the halachic times, here you have them in pictures, and here they come verbally. Starting up here, we have first Alot HaShachar. Alot HaShachar meaning the first light which breaks through at the end of the night. There are not many, there's not much dispute about when the day starts in Judaism. No doubt it starts at Alot HaShachar, because the Torah says, Haboker Or, as soon as there is some light, it is morning, it is day. That does not mean that immediately on after we have seen the first light, that we can immediately, for example, put on our tzitzit and tefillin and do the shacharit prayer. It's still very dark at that hour, so we have to wait for a while, at least until we can distinguish Yakir, until we can distinguish between similar colors, particular white and light blue, as in the tzitzit, when it is light, there's light enough for us to distinguish between the white strings and the techelet and the light blue string. That means that the day has advanced enough for us to put on the talit and tefillin. And actually, we can also do shacharit, but the best time to do shacharit is actually Hanetzach Hama, the moment that the sun rises above the horizon, at least as far as we see the sun rising. Those are the important halachic times in the morning. And there is not much dispute about the length of those times. There is some dispute about the time, for how long we can continue to say the shacharit prayers, how late we can do it. And the rule is that it can be we can say Shema for the first 3 temporal hours of the day, and Shacharit for the first 4 temporal hours of the day. But there is a question about when the temporal hours are, from when they are counted. We'll talk about that a little bit later. After that, we have noon, Tzahorei Hayom, which is the middle point between, as most poskim do today, we'll count from sunrise to sunset. The midpoint between these two times, that is Tzahorei Hayom. And shortly after that, again, half an hour, a temporal hour. After that, we can actually start saying the Mincha prayers. That is the Mincha Gedolah if we do it as early as that. But the normal or the second time for Mincha is 9.5 hours into the day out of that is approximately 3/4 of the day. And there is a special time which is called Pelek HaMincha or Plag HaMincha, which we'll talk about later. Next important point in the daily halacha is the Shkia, the time when the sun drops down under the horizon. And this is very important. And the question of what happens after that, because it's still quite light when the sun is just under the horizon, there's much light. And these times in the evening are critical in Judaism, not only for prayers, but also, I would say, legally, because in Judaism, as you probably know, the day starts in the evening. We learned that from the creation description when it says Vayhi Erev Vayhi Boker, meaning Yom Echad or Yom Sheni, etc. That means that the day in Judaism starts with the evening. And you know that from Shabbat, Chagim, from everything. So, and now it's very difficult to say immediately after the sun sets and it's still very light, and it's difficult to say that a new day has started. So therefore, our sages decided that it would be at a later point than the sunset. The discussion already in the Talmud is when that later point is, and that is something we'll discuss in details in the continuation. The time between the sunset and the time when, according to our halacha, night starts, and there will also the new day called Tzeta Kochavim. That time between these 2 points is called Bein Hashmashot, a kind of intermediate period. So these are the times we are going to deal with in the continuation. You have here just I've taken from a website where one can see all the halachic times for every place in the world. It's called Maizmanim. You see here today for Copenhagen, you have here the dawn, the first light at 4:22. Then you have the Mishiyakir, when you can distinguish between white and light blue. That was some 50 minutes later. And sunrise was at 6:24 this morning. Here you have the latest times for Shema and for Shacharit. You have the noon and the earliest time one can say the Mincha prayers, which is 1:45 approximately. The so-called Plag HaMincha, which we'll be talking about, and sunset tonight will be at 8 o'clock in Copenhagen. And then there is a nightfall. Again, there is various opinions on that. It can be either 8:58 or 9:12 tonight. So that's just to illustrate, and everybody can go into this website, and there are also some explanations given there. As I said, it's called Maizmanim in one word, maizmanim.com, if I'm not mistaken. And you can have a look at that in your spare time. Now, I want to explain what the halachic temporal hour is, in Hebrew called Sha'az Manit. And this is a concept which we use in some of the calculations of the halachic time during the day. The definition, which is the generally accepted definition, is that we take the period of time between sunrise and sunset, and we take that time and divide it by 12. 1/12 of this period is called a sha'az manit. And as you can easily understand, it's longer in the summer than in the winter, except on the equator when it's always identical with an hour of 60 minutes. But in Copenhagen, for example, a sha'az manit in the summer can get up to 88 minutes, while on the shortest day of the year, it's only 35 minutes. And further up north, the variation is, of course, even bigger. So if we talked about that, we can say Shema up to 3 hours after sunrise. It's 3 of those hours. So it's a longer period in the summer and a shorter period in the winter. There are some religious authorities who say that it should be a 12th of the time between Alot HaShachar, the first light, and the time when the stars are visible, which is the Tzet HaKochavim. But the generally accepted is that of sunrise and sunset. Here we are looking briefly at a page from the Talmud, from the Gemara, the tractate of Shabbat, and it is discussed, as you can see here, Ezehu ben hashmashot. How do we define the period between sunset and nightfall? And there are various opinions. Here we see one of the opinions says that it is the time it takes to walk 3/4 of a mile, as it is known in the Gemara. That is one of the accepted answers to the question. Now the question is, how long does it take to walk a mile? Again, I won't go into the whole matter of definition, but in general, what the sages say is that it takes a full day to walk a distance of something like 40 kilometers. Now, that is called 10 harsaot, and it's something like 40 miles of the Gemara. A Gemara mile is somewhere near a kilometer. Now, the question is whether these 40 miles are from sunrise, and it takes there's an additional 5 kilometers between the initial light in the morning and sunrise, and there are similarly 4 or 5 kilometers after sunset until nightfall. The question is whether the 40 miles include the extra 4 or 5, or it's 40 miles from sunrise to sunset, and for that reason the extra 4 or 5 miles are over and above these 40. Now, if the day is 12 hours and you walk 40 miles, that means that you have walked 1 mile in 18 minutes. If the 4 miles are inside the calculation, then the mile is 22.5 minutes per mile. And if it's 5 between first light and sunrise, and also on the other side, then you get a mile of 24 minutes. That is, of course, something which only came up when we had watches that could register these times. We have here a calculation that in the morning, if we say that 4 miles between the first light and sunrise, that would mean that the time period for 4 miles would be 72, 90, or 96 minutes respectively. before sunrise, and today the accepted, mostly accepted time is the 70. That are 72 minutes between the first light and sunrise, and we're talking on the days of equinox, the days when night and day are similar length. Accordingly, also the 3/4 of a mile after the sunset until Zeta Kochavim, until nightfall, will respectively be 13.5 minutes, 17 or 18 minutes. So let's have a closer look upon the definitions in the Talmud, in the Gemara, the definitions of the beginning of the night, when the dates change from the previous day to the next day. This is important, for example, for legal documents, including Ktubot, and you might be aware that one does not have a chuppah between the sunset and the Zeta Kohavim and the full nightfall, for the reason that in that period it's doubtful whether we are still on the previous day or the next day. And the ketubah, the marriage document, being a legal document, it has to have the exact date of when this document came into force. So the one definition found in that same place I showed you in the Gemara, the first definition is that in the beginning, the lower part of the sky, after sunset, becomes gray, while the higher sections of the sky are still blue, red, violet, whatever. And one sign of real darkness, of nightfall, is that the upper part of the sky has got the same gray color as the lower part. The second definition, which we have already mentioned, is the time for walking. An average person could walk the 3/4 of a mile. And that is, of course, something which one could measure really only later on. And then the rabbis started discussing exactly how many minutes that would take. And the third definition, which you probably already have heard about, is the appearance of three average size stars in the sky. You might have met this measurement when we talk about when Shabbat finishes, when we can see the 3 stars in the heaven. All these 3, or more or less, have this common characteristic, which is not problematic. They are all subjective. What exactly is the gray color that you want to see? How much exactly, how long exactly does it take to walk the 3/4 of a mile? And what are average size stars in the heaven, in the sky? Those are subjective measurements, all of them. And at least as far as the number 1 and number 3 is concerned, they are dependent upon the weather. If there are clouds, you can't see any stars, and you can't see the colors in the sky. And they're also dependent upon where you are on the globe in order to decide on these issues. So the whole thing was very, very problematic to set down the exact time for the nightfall. Today, twilight is defined generally among the astronomers according to the scheme you can see on the screen now. We start with civil twilight, and here we take as a starting point, we take the sunset and we calculate how far below horizon the sun has got. As long as the sun is not more than 6 degrees below the horizon, we call that period civil twilight. That means that basically you can read the newspaper in the street outside your house or at the western window without artificial lighting. The next step is called nautical twilight. That is for seamen who on one hand should be able to see stars. The first stars are already there, so they can use their instruments to measure their position, but at the same time, there's light enough for them to see the scales on the measuring instruments. And the third and last stage is when the sun has reached 18 degrees below horizon. That is when we have complete darkness. The opposite, of course, is in the morning when we start with astronomical dawn, nautical dawn, and civil dawn until the sun rises above the horizon. And here we get to Raphael Halevi. He was a very, very talented mathematician and astronomer. He, for a while, he was an assistant of the famous mathematician Leibniz in Germany and Hanover. And he published in 1766, he published a calendar with the times for when you can, in the morning, when you can put on talit and tefillin, and for the termination of Shabbat in the whole year. That was a calendar which could be used every year as long as you find yourself in a place which was on the same that's altitude, if I'm not mistaken, of about 52 degrees, like Hanover itself, Berlin and Amsterdam. People living in those cities could use his calendar, which you can see on the right side of the screen, for every year, and with the dates stated in the Gregorian calendar. He did not say exactly what position of the sun he used for setting his time, but my tutor, Dr. Eran Raviv, he made a calculation and found out that Raphael Halevi had decided that in the morning for putting on, the time for putting on talit and tefillin was when the sun was 8 degrees below the horizon. And as far as the termination of Shabbat, he set the time for when the sun was 7 degrees below the horizon. That would be the time when you could finish Shabbat. Now, how do you calculate all that? Don't be worried. I won't go into this page much longer. That page is mainly put into the presentation in honor of my teacher of math in the secondary school in Copenhagen, St. Jørgens Gymnasium. I was quite a good student of mathematics until we got to three-dimensional mathematics, where I had big difficulties. until my teacher Bockenhäuser said to me, "I think you must have been born in 2 dimensions only," because I couldn't really cope with the third one. So as a punishment for that, I had to cope now in order to calculate the position of the sun under the horizon with some quite complicated trigonometric equations. But Baruch Hashem, this time it went okay. Now we are going to look at the specific problems of the northern countries. And I start with this commentary of Rabbi Israel Lipschitz. Commentary, it's called Tiferet Israel. Rabbi Lipschitz got a position as a rabbi of the town of Danzig. And he wrote quite a surprising statement in his commentary to the Mishnah at the end of the tractate of the first chapter of the tractate of Brachot. He wrote, "I am in big doubts about the northern countries, like our own city, Danzig, and Copenhagen and Stockholm and so on, where in the month of June and July, the night is light as in the day, or at least now he was aware that he had exaggerated slightly. So he writes, at least at the midnight, you are still able to distinguish between white and light blue. So how on earth can you find out when to say the Shema and when to say the various prayers?" Apparently, he found out that it wasn't that bad after all, because he stayed in Danzig, where he passed away in 1860. Now, here I have a list which is quite central. I'm sorry it's written in Hebrew, but I'd explain everything. I have looked at in what places we have halachic difficulties using the measure of degrees of the sun to see when they have various halachic times begin and end. And I use mainly the measurements which are accepted in halakha today. That means, for example, that alot hashachar, that the first light in the morning, will be set when the sun is 16 degrees below the horizon. And the time for putting on talit and tefillin is here a bit earlier than Rabbi Rafael Halevi. It is 11 degrees below horizon. That is in the morning. Now we talk about the evening. Here we have this time for Zeta Kochavim, for nightfall, and you can say together with that, the end of Shabbat would be when the sun is 8.5 degrees below, more than required by Rafael Halevi, who used 7 degrees. I put in also the 7.1 degrees, which was set by Rafael Halevi, and was also used by a German Jewish astronomer Bertolt Cohen at the end of the 19th century. They used 7 or 7.1 degrees below horizon. In parentheses, I should mention that the times of Bertolt Cohen was used for many years by the so-called Machzikei Hadat, the very Orthodox Jewish community in Copenhagen. Here we have the 6 degrees, which are important for our further discussion, which was also the end of what we call the civil twilight. And we have also places with 0 degrees, where there is no sunrise and no sunset, respectively summer and winter. in the outmost northern regions. Let's see who has a problem. For example, if we take Copenhagen, we see that there is at least one day of the year, actually a couple of months, when the sun does not go more than 11 degrees below horizon. That's what we call the light nights. And of course, the same is in the morning. We have no real alot shachar. We don't have 16 degrees below horizon for the sun, so we don't have a real alot shachar during the summer months from somewhere in May until August. So the question is, when can we start putting on talit and tefillin? And so that is a problem. If we go further north to Stockholm, we see that they do not have the sun below 8.5 degrees. So when will they finish Shabbat in Stockholm and all the places which are north of Stockholm? You can see here in the list. We have Oslo, Helsinki, Turku, and not to speak of Trondheim, which for a long time was considered to be the northernmost Jewish community, which it is not. But anyway, in all these places, we have a problem about the end of Shabbat, because the sun does not get far enough down under the horizon, so it doesn't get the degree of darkness and the stars in the sky, which we would consider necessary for the end of Shabbat. So that is a problem. Okay, we'll see it in more details when we get to looking at the actual calendar, and I hope it will be more understandable when we look at that. This is the first printed calendar of the Jewish community of Copenhagen. See the leap year 5622, and that is the year beginning Rosh Hashanah in 1861 till September 1862. It was compiled, or it was calculated by Dr. Milziner, and he was the head of the extracurricular Jewish teaching of children in those years. And I'm sure it also had the approval of the chief rabbi, Abraham Alexander Wolf, who was the chief rabbi in Copenhagen for over 60 years, from 1829 until his death in 1892. What we see here is a monthly page for a month of Marcheshvan. We see the dates, the Jewish date, and the general calendar date. These are the Jewish days. This is Rosh Chodesh Marcheshvan, which was on a Shabbat, the Lördag Shabbat, the 5th of October. And the month end here, there were 30 days that year in Marcheshvan until the 30th of Marcheshvan, which was Sunday, the 3rd of November. Then we have the parasha, the weekly portion, which is read, and we have also defined exactly where in the Torah and the Haftarah, where you can find them in your Tanakh. Special days in the Jewish calendar. There was a time when it was customary, some people do it still, where it was customary to keep 3 days of fasting in the beginning of the month of Marcheshvan, after the people had had so much to eat during the all the festivals of Tishrei. So they had 3 fasts on the Monday, the Thursday, and the Monday, and that was apparently still a widespread custom in Copenhagen at this time. So these days are pointed out in the calendar here. Here are days of the Danish public, which are important, like the birthday of the king or one of the princesses, and this is called Flyttedag, that had to do with moving from apartment to apartment. That was the information found here. It doesn't say on this page anything about times, but we have on another page in the calendar, we have the times for the beginning and end of Shabbat, and the days of the times of the services in the synagogue. Until that time, the synagogue in Copenhagen was inaugurated in 1833. That is 28 years before this calendar. And in the regulations of the synagogue, it simply states that the times of service will be announced on the public table in the synagogue. So people had actually to go there to see when the services took place. From now on, the Shabbat services were defined in this calendar almanac, and but the weekday services were not at this stage entered into the calendar. As we are going to make here a comparison, I want you to have a brief look at the general Danish almanac for the same year, 1861. Here again, it goes by month, but of course, the general month, January. In the Christian calendar, each day has some kind of a holy person giving name to that day. But what interests us here, by the way, it says for the 1st of January that it was the day of the Brit Milah of Jesus. What interests us here is the time which is given for 1 day a week for every Wednesday. This calendar states when the sun rises and sets. And it also says how long the twilight is on that day. When it says twilight here, we speak about the civil twilight, which we said was when the sun is 6 degrees below horizon. We see here that on this day it was 52 minutes. A week later, it was 51 minutes, and so on. But the times are only given for the Wednesday of each week. I can't see that here, just a second. Here you see most of you, I suppose, know this tower, the round tower in Copenhagen. It's very near the synagogue, and it was built by Christian IV in 1642, and it served as the observatory of Copenhagen, where they calculated all these times that are mentioned in the almanac. And you probably also know that we have the special feature of Hashem's name, God's name, in Hebrew letters here in this rebus on the tower. Now, why is this important? Because it interested me to see whether there would be a connection between the hours in the general almanac and the hours set by Dr. Milziner for the end of Shabbat. Now, first of all, we did a calculation, my tutor and I. This is the kind of calculation he used to calculate Raphael Halevi's times, or how far below the horizon the sun should be at the end of Shabbat, for example. That's how he calculated a kind of reverse calculation from the actual times given back to the to the source of how many degrees, he said. And we took the hours of this of the first almanac in Copenhagen, and we found that the average position of the sun below the horizon, where for the times of the end of Shabbat set in the calendar, was, as you can see up here somewhere in here, was 6.2 degrees. Now 6.2 is less than stipulated by Raphael Halevi, but it is still halachically viable according to such authorities as Gaon Mivilna, Rabbi Eliyahu from Vilna, and the founder of the Chabad movement, Shlomo Zalman from Ladi. They accept a position of between 4 and 5 degrees below horizon for the end of Shabbat. So the 6 degrees, we could say they are kosher. They are not according to the generally accepted standard today, which I mentioned was 8.5 degrees, but it is okay. Then I took and I looked at the times in the general almanac for the end of the civil twilight, and I had to extrapolate from Wednesdays to Saturdays. Not important for you, but I got here to the time when, according to the almanac, would be the end of the civil twilight, and I found that the times given in the Jewish almanac for the end of Shabbat was exactly those times rounded up to the nearest 5 minutes. So that 1718 became 1720, 1732 became 1735, and so on. There are 2 exceptions from but in general, we could say that it is most likely that Dr. Milziner made his calculation based upon the astronomic findings of the general Danish almanac for that year. So that is how it was in the first years, and it didn't change much until suddenly there was a big change in 1894. In 1894, all the times in the entrance of Shabbat and termination of Shabbat, they were suddenly moved some 10 or sometimes 15 minutes forward. So I thought, what happened here? Had it to do with the passing of Rabbi Wolf and the era of a new rabbi in the Jewish community in Copenhagen in 1892? That was Professor Simonson. Did it have to do with that? But my doubts were solved when I came about the general almanac again for that year, and from that almanac I learned that in 1894 Denmark decided to join the newly formed international time zones. The time zones that we know today, with the starting point in Greenwich in England, Greenwich Mean Time, with the starting point there, we move the clocks for 1 hour for each 15 degrees of longitude, plus to the east and minus to the west. So the Central European time is an hour after Greenwich, which is the exact astronomical time for the longitude of 15 degrees. Now, Copenhagen is only 12 point something degrees east of Greenwich. So that means that there was not a full hour difference before the introduction of the time zones, so therefore there was a difference of these about 10 minutes, 9 point something minutes, because Copenhagen had to accept, or Denmark had to accept the time which was astronomically correct for the longitude 15, in spite of being somewhat west of that line. So that was the reason for the 10-minute leap, also in the Jewish halachic times. So what are the problems in the north, in the northern Jewish communities? We have a problem which is not a, shall we say, not a halachic problem, but we have a social problem in the winter time, when the days are short and Shabbat starts very early Friday afternoon. So what do the communities do with that? On the other hand, we have a problem on the long Fridays in the summer. Should we start Shabbat at 10 o'clock at night and have our Shabbat festive Shabbat meal as a midnight feast or something like that? We have a question: when does Shabbat end on the long days of the summer and long Saturdays? Will the sun at all get low enough to end Shabbat? And finally, on the short days of the winter, we also have a problem because the sun rises very late. So when can we put on talit and tefillin? When can we say shacharit, when we also have to go to work or school or whatever during those days? And the sun, for example, in Copenhagen, rises in the winter at 8:30, when most people already have to be in school or in their office or at workplace, wherever it is. So those are the problems which the Jewish calendars have to cope with. We're going to look how it was dealt with in Copenhagen. For example, the entry of Shabbat on the short days in the winter. The earliest time for sunset in Copenhagen is 3:37 in the afternoon. Now, this was actually very problematic. In the original Luach, the time was actually, I have taken into account Central European time. It was actually set to a time which is after sunset. And actually, Shabbat should be brought in at least some minutes before sunset. Not only that, but with the correction of 1894, it was even set at 3:45, which is 8 minutes after the sunset. And I can just to tell you, today it's normal, for example, in Israel, in most places, to light candles 20 minutes before sunset. And in any case, Shabbat should be brought in before the sun sets. So this was a problematic point in the Copenhagen calendar. In the meantime, it has been somehow corrected. Today, the earliest candle lighting time is set to 3:35, which is a couple of minutes before the earliest sunset. But it is a problem. It's, of course, a problem for all those Jews who work wherever they work, and not only do they have to ask to be not to work on the Shabbat, but also to go in the middle of the day on the Friday is a problematic issue. Also, at least when I was young and lived in Copenhagen, in Copenhagen, in Denmark, they were very strict with closing hours of shops. shops usually closed at 5:30 in the afternoon. The one day on which shops were allowed to work later was on Fridays, where they could keep open to 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. And those were, of course, the very lucrative shopping hours for the shopkeepers and tradesmen. So this early closing down, including the month of December before Christmas and all that, was very, very problematic. That could be a reason why the religious leadership was reluctant to introduce Shabbat too early. But that was a problem, and that is a problem even more so the further north you get, the earlier is the early sunset in winter.
Pinchas,
Yes.
yeah, just to emphasize the point that you are making, in other words, if one is lighting candles after the sunset, you're actually violating the Shabbat by
Mhm.
doing so.
Yes.
So it's not just closing down the shop, but that if someone
Yes.
were to, if the sun has already set and you didn't manage to get home, then it would be better not to light the candles than to do so, because by lighting the candles, you're violating. And many times there's a tradition that people have without this knowledge. So they say, oh, well, we light every Friday night, we gather, we light the candles, and we have Kiddush. In the summer, then that's fine. But in the winter, if you're doing so after the normal work hours, let's say 6 o'clock, everyone comes home from work and the kids come home from school, you're lighting the candles and making Kiddush, you're actually violating the Shabbat by doing so, because you would need to light the Kiddush. You can make much later, that's not a problem, but the candles themselves, if you're lighting them after sunset, you're violating the Shabbat.
Very important point. Thank you. That is, of course, as Rabbi Cohen says, very, very true. In the summer, there was a problem again because the sun sets very late. In Copenhagen, it's as late as about 9 o'clock, and with summertime, it's it's almost 10 o'clock before the sun sets. And there is a rule that you can introduce Shabbat earlier than just before sunset. And that is the time which is called Plaka Mincha. I won't go into all the details, but that is considered the earliest time that you should introduce Shabbat. And that time in Copenhagen on the longest day is 8 minutes past 7. And now with summertime, which has been working since 1980 in Denmark, it is 8 minutes past 8. So that is actually the earliest time you should bring in Shabbat. In the original Lurch, again, corrected to the Middle European time, Shabbat was introduced together with the time for Mincha in the synagogue at 7:30, which was problematic because you see that with at least with summertime, the Lag Mincha is only after 8 o'clock, so 7:30 was very early. But that is how they worked up to about 1980. There were a few years of summertime in Denmark before that, during World War I and during World War II, but it was abolished after the war. But it was reintroduced in 1980 in Denmark and has been used since then. And then the problem would be if we say 8:30 again. Sorry, this was of course on the other hand, saying mincha at that time was also a bit problematic, having Mincha and Arvit before it was actually inside the Plaka Mincha. So they would have to set it to 8:30 if we should just add an hour. But this time they found a good solution in Copenhagen. They set the candle lighting to 8:15. But on the other hand, starting the Mincha service in the synagogue at 8 o'clock. This was a very good decision because it also meant that you would be saying the Mincha prayer before the Plaka Mincha, which is the desirable way of doing it, and then having light candling after the Plaka Mincha. That is actually the ideal solution. That is what is customary today also in many communities in Israel, when we also have summertime in Israel now. So Shabbat comes in relatively late, and it's often a problem having such a late meal with your children and so on. So there are many communities where you also have an early Kabbalat Shabbat, an early acceptance of Shabbat. But then the communities are usually very strict in having the mincha prayer said before this so-called Plaka Mincha and the actual lighting of candles and the Kabbalat Shabbat after the Plaka Mincha. And that is what was achieved by this change that was made in Copenhagen in 1980.
Yeah, the problem arises that I've heard from many of our Talmidim is that if you have the candle lighting at such a time, and you have someone who's, let's say, half an hour walking distance from the synagogue, they can't light before, let's say, in this case, 8:08, which means that, and if they're then walking, then they will usually miss out on for sure on the mincha, but probably on Kabbalat Shabbat as well. So there's a social aspect to that, but the halachic setting is that you cannot light before this time. So that is how things are, and for sure you can't light after you come back home because the community has already accepted upon itself Shabbat. So that is a problem or a complication. The second thing I wanted to mention is that many times there's confusion because if people look at a Chabad calendar, for example, then they'll see Shabbat will begin, let's say, 9:30 in the evening, and they're confused because they see the community starting an hour and a half earlier. And the reason is because the community is trying to set the earliest time possible, as has been explained here very well. Um, ac- According to many halachic opinions, once a community has accepted Shabbat upon itself, then that is for the entire city. So therefore, one should follow the community and the time that the community is setting for Shabbat, even if it's earlier. That is what is necessary. If one is on some island on vacation, then you can choose the later time, even if you don't have a community around you. I just wanted that bringing in that halachic perspective as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we get to the critical question of the termination of Shabbat on the long summer days, when the sun does not go down more than a limited number of degrees below horizon. If we look at Copenhagen, latest sunset, we have already seen that in the summer is close to 10 o'clock. Without summertime, it's close to 9 o'clock. So the original calendar set the time as 10:05 in the evening, and actually that is the one time which has never been changed until now. In 1980, with the introduction of summertime in Denmark, it was moved, of course, an hour later to 11:05, and in spite of all criticism or requests for changes and so on, all the rabbis of Copenhagen, ever since Rabbi Wolf until this day, have decided to keep the time at 11:05, which is at the position, the original decision of a position of 6 degrees below horizon of the sun. I don't know why, but apparently that was a general feeling. Number one, not to be very critical of previous rabbis' decisions. And also, there was usually fireworks in the Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen at 11:45 on Motzei Shabbat. So this time would enable people still to get to see the fireworks. That's, of course, just in a humoristic parenthesis. But in any case, in this particular, there have been changes, as we have seen. There have been changes in the times as they were set over the years. But this particular latest ending of Shabbat has been preserved from the very first day. In more northern countries, we have a situation where you do not even get to end of civil twilight, not even to the 6 degrees of the sun going below the horizon. And there, the generally accepted halachic solution today have been a lot of written a lot of halachic discourses on this question. When to terminate Shabbat when you were in an area where the sun does not set very much below horizon. The generally accepted rule today is to use the astronomical midnight as the cutting point between the Shabbat and the Sunday. That means that, for example, I know this, if we speak about Oslo, I believe it's something like 1:20 in the morning, which is the astronomic midnight, which can be used. On one hand, it can be used as the end of Shabbat, the making Havdalah. On the other hand, you can actually already from that time also say your Shacharit tefillah for Sunday morning and put on talit and tefillin. That is special, and I know that many rabbis recommend not to go further north much further north than that, into places where the sun does not set at all during the summer, because that is, again, the same rule would probably apply, that you should use the lowest position of the sun in the night as the cutting point, but it is very problematic when there's no sunset at all. So these are the very difficult problems of people living or traveling in the north, above particularly above the Arctic Circle. But that is the solution which has become generally accepted, I think, by the halachic authorities. And last not least, we have the late mornings in the winter. Again, I start from Copenhagen. In the winter, the sun rises as late as 8:39 in the morning. Usually the tefillot, the weekday tefillot in Copenhagen synagogue have been somewhere around 7 o'clock. There were years in the beginning where they also went 6:30 on weekday mornings, but generally it has been something like between 6:45 and 7:15. Most years, 7 o'clock has been set as the time, which would enable people to get to the synagogue on one hand, but also to get to their studies or their work at somewhere around 8:30. So that was the accepted time. But in the part of the winter, we have a problem that the accepted 11 degrees under horizon measure, which has been accepted for putting on the talit and tefillin, was only at 7:12. So how can you start the tefillah at 7 o'clock? Some years they simply started at 7:15. But again, that is problematic for people going to work and studies. So they went back to 7 o'clock. But the solution was that at 7 o'clock, the first part of the tefillah, the introductory brachot, Birchot HaShachar, and the Psukei de Zimra, the psalms which are read in the beginning of tefillah before the central part of the tefillah, they would be said from 7 o'clock, and only when they were said before getting into the central part of the tefillah with the Shema and the Amida, only then would people put on talit and tefillin, and that will be after the hour of 7:12. So again, that solves this problem in Copenhagen. I really do not know how they cope with those problems further north. But at least you know now what the problems are, and then you have to look in your own communities for the way they were solved. So here we are. I wish you that the hours of light that you experience will be many more, and very stronger, much more than the dark hours that you experience. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And if we have any questions, I know time is a bit late, but if we do have any questions, you can write in the chat. I just wanted to mention two other perspectives that fit into this whole explanation. First of all, the fast days that also follow these times, and there's a difference with the fasting. You know, we had shiurim about you had a shiur with Rav Shmuel about Tzomot Rabbanan, the fast days from our sages, and the ones that are written in the Torah will have to follow the stricter guidelines of the times that we have seen today, whereas the ones from our sages, from the Rabbanan, can follow the more lenient. So therefore, you end up with a shorter fast, which will follow the shorter times in the Luach. The second point, which is also practical, is Spirat HaOmer, coming up just after, right after the first day of the night, from the second night of Pesach onwards. So also we can count the Omer every night only after what is considered the 3 stars. So even if you can pray Arvit earlier, the Ma'ariv prayer, the evening prayer before, even from Plag Mincha, as was mentioned, you have to wait for the later time, which can, as the farther north you get, as was just mentioned now, and the farther we get later of Sfirat HaOmer, we can end up with quite a late time. So the practical solution is just make sure you count after whatever the time was for Havdalah that week in your community. So you can follow that or just add a few minutes every day, because sometimes there are a couple of minutes added each day. So follow that time to make sure you're counting the Omer properly. So we have a few questions in the chat. Pinchas, if you would like to take them, bevakasha.
I think that's more for you. And one Eid after Suda Shlishit in Sivan, when the Havdalah is after 36 minutes midnight. I understand you can eat until the time that is meant to be Haftarah. We usually don't eat after sunset, but that I leave to you, Rabbi, to answer that one. You are muted. You are mute.
Okay, so Suda Shlishit is the third meal, and we begin it before whatever the time. Again, you just got the advice. You can look at My Zmanim and figure out when the sunset is. So whenever the sunset is, you should start the Suda Shlishit, the third meal, before sunset. And as long as you're continuing the meal, then you can continue to eat Suda Shlishit. So if you continue to eat and you're sitting and learning or reading and you're continuing your Suda, you can continue it as long as you, if you finished your Suda, then you should finish it as well. So if you're not going to sit there for 3 hours until after midnight, then that is correct. Then you should finish as soon as you have finished. And Birkat Hamazon can be said within 72 minutes of after. If you forgot to say Birkat Hamazon and you remember, then you can say it as well. One other practical thing that is interesting, if you're as far north as Oslo, as was mentioned, so Havdalah can only be said, the lighting of the candle can only be done on Motzei Shabbat. Havdalah can actually be said until Tuesday, but if your Shabbat is over 12:30 or 1 in the evening, in the, I don't know what to call it, midnight the next morning, then you have to do the candle lighting immediately, because if you wait around, it's already Sunday morning and you will not be able to light the candle. So that's an interesting halakha. I was once with the family on vacation in Lapland, and it was the same minute that Shabbat was over and midnight and the next morning was all in the same minute. So I think our kids were quite happy to finish Shabbat it was after midnight. So we were also there for the fast day of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, and my kids were like, can you please make the sun set? It's already 12 o'clock at night. Just make it set or find something to do, because they were quite hungry by midnight after fasting the whole day. So it's plan your vacation accordingly, because we do have those summer fasts as well during those problematic days. We have Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Tisha B'Av, of course. Well, we shouldn't be on vacation anyway, and Tisha B'Av we should be mourning. So that is interesting. Any other questions or comments from anyone?
So thank you very much. It's been lovely talking to you. Wish you much success in the course, etc., and in your life.
Thank you so much for joining us and teaching us. I would say that anyone who's listened to these these two shiurim from you knows a lot more than even the average yeshiva student and living in the complicated situations that we are. It's actually very relevant, much more than someone living in Jerusalem, for example, because you're dealing with this all of the time. And you really enlightened and shared your wisdom and knowledge on this subject. I'm not going to get into those mathematical equations, not the 2 dimensions and not the 3 ones. So I'm going to leave those for you and for the scientists out there to figure that out for us. And it's fantastic to see how this has been for hundreds of years, actually, through in these communities dealing with it, and how important the times are that we sync ourselves according to nature, which is the whole Jewish calendar that we started just now, right? That we're starting this week with Nisan and the spring and everything we learned, right, about that, but also how challenging it gets to be synced with nature, with the tefillot, when we're living in these communities, both in the winter and the summer. Thank you so much. Shavua Tov to everyone. And we will upload these shiurim. So if you know someone who's missed them, or you want to review them once again, you'll be able to see them there. Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shabbat
Great to
Tov.
see you all.
Shavua Tov.
Thank
Thank you. Shavua Tov.